This is Scott Becker with the Becker Private Equity Podcast. We're thrilled today to be joined by a brilliant entrepreneur. And we love to feature entrepreneurs who are self-starters, who build businesses from scratch, who have the wherewithal, the moxie to start things and make them work. And we're joined today by Mark Krasnow. Mark Krasnow is the founder of a company called BullsEye Resources. We became familiar with BullsEye because years ago, one of the companies I'm affiliated with, Becker's Healthcare, started to work with BullsEye, and we just loved working with them. And so wanted to hear more of his business story and how he got going and a lot more. Mark, can you take a moment and introduce yourself and tell the audience a little bit about what you do and how you started?
Sure. Thank you, Scott. Thanks for inviting me to participate. It's been great to work with you and your team over the years. So a quick snapshot is that I've been a repeat entrepreneur. And I know while you were going to law school, I was at the business school across the river from you. And I've done several entrepreneurial ventures. And I know part of the podcast is in the private equity world. So multiple ventures that have involved raising about $40 million in venture capital and private equity over the years. I initially did an early stage disease management and remote patient monitoring business that was acquired, and then an e-commerce business that was backed by private equity, and that business was acquired. And about 20 years ago, I was in between things, trying to figure out what I would do next. And I found myself going to conferences in different industries to try to learn a little bit and think about what do I want to do next. And at some conference, I was struck by the idea that there are many speakers at the conference, and it was always difficult. I know you guys had your huge conference last week, and I love going to conferences and learning. And I was struck by the idea that I couldn't go to all the sessions at some of these conferences, and I was really interested in having sort of a 1-page or 2-page executive summary of what the key takeaways were from that session at a conference. And so born from that was a content creation business focused on the conference and event space of creating cliff notes of conferences and other events. I didn't know that was going to turn out to be a business. I know you have written and said the idea of focusing on niches. So the niche that BullsEye Resources is focused on is turning the great ideas that are shared at conferences and events into cliff notes, short, concise executive summaries for a busy sort of C-level audience. We've now done that for 20 years for thousands of conferences and webinars, and sort of turned into a custom content business largely focused on events.
I'll give just the quickest endorsement. We love working with Mark and his company, and what they do it so efficiently and so great. It's incredible. Mark, let me ask you a question. Being an entrepreneur, is that born or could that be made? How do you sort of think about that? Sort of like, and what advice would you give to other entrepreneurs?
I think of being an entrepreneur is about seeing a problem that you think exists and trying to come up with an idea to solve that problem. I think it's sort of as simple as that. I mean, there are entrepreneurs that work within large organizations, and then there are entrepreneurs like me and maybe you that I spent 7 years at Procter & Gamble, a large Fortune 500 company, but I really enjoy the sort of freedom of doing something on your own. But I think entrepreneurs are about finding problems, solving it, and then trying to figure out how do I put together resources, people, funding, systems, technology to try to solve that problem. And then over time, you have more problems, which are scaling, adding more customers. So I think entrepreneurs are sort of driven to solve problems and then try to build something. At least that's what's motivated me.
No, thank you. And could you, really 2 questions I want to ask you. Could you give other founders a couple pieces of advice? What advice should you give somebody starting a business? And then I'll also ask you what you're most focused on and excited about this year.
So I would say that I think sort of the opposite of the advice is that I think often entrepreneurs or people starting companies become obsessed with the idea of raising money. And I hear people often congratulate themselves and say, we just raised 1 million or 10 million or whatever amount of money. And I guess I'm sort of an old fashioned, I always feel like try to solve the problem and at the most basic level, the idea of a minimum viable product. And so how do you create the product or service you're offering? And then who identify your target customer and figure out how to go sell it so that somebody will buy what it is that you're wanting to sell. And I think that you build businesses in stages, and then you may think about how do I raise money? How do I scale? But I think oftentimes people that are starting businesses become sort of infatuated with the idea of raising money and scaling without first solving the problem and creating a model and a process to produce the product and to get a customer to pay for it. So I would say start at the most basic level. What's your product or service? Who's your customer? And can you create a product or service that people will pay for? And then you can do it in stages of figuring out how to raise money and scale that.
But I think that's really right. I mean, the real core is getting customers and taking care of customers greatly. That's the real core. And then you could figure out how to really build from there. When people go sort of backwards, raise a ton of money, and then figure out what they're doing, we always view that as a much riskier, and often sort of they put the cart before the horse. You know, you see so many people, and I'll use the Harvard analogy, people that go to Harvard, some people come out of Harvard thinking they now own the world. Other people come out of Harvard knowing now it's time to start hustling and really working. And it almost feels very similar to me. Like some people raise money and think, okay, now they're going to sort of do something. Other people figure out a business, then they raise money. And I think the approach of now I'm really going to start working now that I got out of Harvard, and now that I'm going to really start going after it, before I raise money, I'm going to really start figuring out my minimal viable product. And what I really want to do first is I think the right approach. I love that. Talk for a second about any favorite professors that had a big influence on you when you were at the business school.
Several, but I would say the best and greatest professor I ever had was Clayton Christensen, who passed away a few years ago. But and he wrote sort of the landmark book, The Innovator's Dilemma, which was an amazing book. And I was very fortunate to have his class as he was writing that. And he shared an early draft of that book. And he's written a lot of things about healthcare. And I won't go into all the details of that, but he was a phenomenal professor in the way he made you think and challenged you. And I think I was really lucky and fortunate to get to have him as a professor, in that he's one of sort of the leading innovation and business thinkers of probably the last, I don't know, 10 or 20 years.
And talk about Clayton Christensen. One thing that always struck me about Clayton Christensen, aside from the brilliance of his writings, and he also had a great book on how you lived your life,
yes,
was how gracious he was with people. Can you talk about that for a moment? Because aside from his brilliance, his way of dealing with people was uncommon and graceful.
Yeah, he was so humble and down to earth, and he was a phenomenal listener. He really had no ego at all. And his book that he talked about how to live your life, I think came out of the fact that at the end of each semester, he would sort of give a lecture to the class about personal values, about living with integrity. And he had tremendous success. He had been sort of a personal consultant to Andy Grove at Intel, but he was so humble and was really focused on the idea of values and integrity and intellectual honesty and no ego whatsoever. He was always focused, and he had been on boards and in businesses, and he was always focused on what's the right answer. And trying to look at data and drive the right answer as opposed to ego. He was the most humble and understated person I've probably ever been exposed to. And I think that, and he was a very religious person, but I think that everyone in the class had tremendous respect for his humility and his intellectual creativity of always just trying to find out what's the right answer to the question and the problem. He was really inspirational, I think, to everyone who had his class.
Take a moment, another moment. You mentioned Andrew Grove. he was a famous sort of, the founder, but really the driver of Intel through its greatness. And there's so much to learn from him. But one of his famous books, his famous sayings, was "Only the paranoid survive."
Yeah.
And Andy Grove was an immigrant, a driven, you know, fascinating person. Talk a little bit about that. You strike me as not a paranoid person, one of the most centered people I get to talk to. Do you have to be paranoid to survive in business? I mean, I know we're always worried about making sure our business is going great, our people are taken care of, but how important is that paranoia that Andy Grove talked about?
Paranoia may be sort of an extreme. As an aside, I was at a conference recently where the current CEO of Intel, who I think his name is Pat Gelsinger, was talking that he worked for Andy Grove for 30 years. And he said in those 30 years, Andy Grove complimented him like 3 times. So I don't know that the concept of paranoia, I mean, he was pretty successful based on that mantra. But I think the idea of some degree of fear, especially at the current moment, that the world is changing so quickly in every industry, and that you have to be able to adapt and to think forward. I think if you just continue to do the things that you've done forever, the same processes, that I think you have to have a belief that we have to change what we're doing, or we're unlikely to be successful going into the future. I think in almost any industry, you have to be, you can't be complacent because you won't survive for very long. So I think that the adage, I don't think of the terms of paranoia, but the idea of constantly trying to figure out where things are going, how do we do it differently, how do we do it better, what do our customers want, how do we deliver on what they want, how do we try to, even sort of in a Steve Jobs sort of way, think about unanticipated customer needs that maybe the customer doesn't even know yet. I mean, it's harder, it's easier to say and harder to do, but I think there's a lot of fear that motivates change.
You strike me as a constant learning and evolving person. How do you find the motivation to do that? And anything recently that you've read or that you've listened to that has been helpful towards your own learning or motivation or anything of the sort?
I don't know. So the fact that our business involves creating summaries of conferences, and that I've always believed that conferences are a forum for sharing ideas. My guess is that last week at your conference, the Becker's Annual Healthcare Conference, that the speakers were sharing important ideas, and they had really put on their calendar that they're going to be with this audience and share. So I feel fortunate, and that I learn a tremendous amount based on the nature of the work that we do, that we hear. I mean, we've Nobel Prize winners, and I think in the 20 years since that we've done this business, 300 of the CEOs of the Fortune 500, and have constantly exposed to people that have written new books. And so I'm reading books. I know that was one of your questions, but I feel, so I really enjoy the nature of our work, which is hearing thought leaders at conferences that are experts in their industries, whatever that is, healthcare, technology, business. I mean, one of our longstanding clients for 20 some years is Harvard Business Review. They have, we've created executive summaries of about 600 webinars for Harvard Business Review, and each one of those is better than the next. Of someone who's written a book, it's been published by HBR, and then there's a webinar where they summarize the key takeaways from their book. And I have a team of people that write and edit and do graphic design, but I read every single one of those, and those are thought leaders about every subject you can imagine: entrepreneurialism, managing large organizations, infusing technology or AI into new businesses. So I constantly feel like maybe almost intimidated by hearing these leaders in every industry, of thinking, well, I'm not doing enough. I have this relatively small custom content business, but I love learning by hearing these experts in every industry, including people in your world, Scott, and you, your own podcast and your own ideas. So I don't know, I don't know if that answers your question or sort of rambles on, but that's a lot of source of information. Is hearing phenomenal speakers at conferences. I love that aspect of our work.
Amazing. No, I love working with you, and I love listening to your thoughts and things. One last question, Mark. What are you most focused on and excited about this year? What are you most focused on and excited about currently?
So we're focused on thinking about sort of new types of products for content consumption. I've had other clients say to me in previous years that the PDF will die at some point in time, and that people will consume information differently. And that hasn't exactly happened. People still read, but we're looking into sort of new products and new forms of content delivery, maybe that appeal to a younger audience, things that are more video, more multimedia, with the same basic concept, which is that we think events, conferences, webinars have great information, and how do we boil that down into a concise form? Historically, our business has been creating a written executive summary of 2, 3, 4 pages, and we're looking at other forms to deliver content through multimedia, being it video and other ways. And you're doing a podcast now, so those are sort of, we're thinking of other products that we can launch that deliver on the same idea of taking the key ideas from an event and then distributing them more broadly to a broader audience. And so we're working on new product development right now is one of the things I'm excited about.
Thank you very much. To our audience, I want to thank Mark Krasnow, the founder of BullsEye Resources, one of the best in the business, for joining us on the Becker Private Equity Podcast. Mark, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Scott. I really enjoyed it.